So after you've designed your experiment and you're ready to begin, the first thing you'll need to do is find somebody to test, find somebody to participate in your experiment. So you're going to need to find some way of recruiting your participants. And there's several ways you could do this. One method is to use what's called a subject pool. So there's a lot of subject pools. Depending on what research institution you work for, you might have some standard subject pools available to you. This is just established groups of people who have agreed to be contacted about participating in studies. So these are people who have previously agreed to participate in whatever kind of research comes along. Another way that you could get people to participate in your research is by just doing advertising. You know, a lot of universities and research colleges and stuff, they'll do this kind of thing where they'll just put flyers around campus asking students or anybody else that's around if they'd like to, you know, maybe earn a few bucks, if they want to volunteer some time and help out with this scientific research they're doing. So yeah, just advertising, whether it's in a poster or on the internet or whatever, just trying to contact people that way. Another common method that people use is just literally walking up to people and asking them to participate. So personal appeals, like interviews. This is a great way to measure some kinds of people. This is a great way to get access to certain groups of people. Like if you want people who go to the gym to participate in your study, well, you could just go to the gym and start asking people if they'd like to participate. So as you can see, using a personal appeal can be a great way to capture that target group, that group that you're the most interested in. So after you figure out the best way to get people to participate, you're going to have to decide how exactly you want to do your study. You know, we've already designed it and everything. We know which conditions we have and the order that we're going to do them. We know those big ideas. We've solved those big problems, but now we have to worry about the details. We want to make sure that we standardize our procedure very, very carefully, because it is surprisingly easy to introduce extraneous variables, or you could call them artifacts, into your procedure. So just to give you an example, let's say in your study you and a few other people are collaborating to collect some data, and one of you greets your participants warmly, and you're just naturally more friendly, more bubbly person, and people just respond to that. People appreciate the friendliness that you show them. Even though you say the exact same thing every time and your partner says the same thing as well, you just say it differently, and that difference might have an effect. So you need to be aware of these kinds of things. It's really hard to standardize things perfectly, to have things exactly the same when you're, meeting with multiple people and stuff like that. But you want to try as best as you can. And there's multiple ways that you can do this kind of standardization. There's various standardization procedures you could use. One common one is to create a written protocol. In other words, you write a speech for your experimenters to read off every time a participant comes to the lab. And if everybody reads it in the same way, at the same speed, with the same tone of voice, you can be assured that it is going to be as standardized as you can get. Another common way that we do standardization is by creating a written set of instructions for participants. So, the experimenter might have their script, but then they hand the participant something to read. And obviously, if you give every participant the same piece of paper, that'll be standardized. Another common standardization procedure we use is automation. In other words, can you do it with a machine? Can you do it with a computer program? Can you do it with something that will always do it exactly the same way every time? If we can remove that human element, then we don't have to worry about human error. Another common technique that's used is just creating a list of standardized answers to frequently asked questions. It's quite common for participants to ask a lot of questions before and after an experiment, and you want your experimenters to know how to respond. So just, basically write a FAQ for your study so that your experimenters know how to respond. Another great thing you could do is if you have multiple people doing this experiment, like you and a partner or a couple of partners, you want to train on how you're going to do it together so that everybody's on the same page. Everybody got the same training at the same time and you all understand exactly how to do it. And then finally, another great standardization procedure you can use is to have each experimenter test their participants across all conditions. So have like experimenter 1 test participants in both the treatment and the control groups, and have experimenter 2 also test in the treatment and the control groups. By having everybody do every condition, if there is any kind of difference between them, it'll be spread out across all conditions. Another thing you can do is use blinds. A blinded experiment, that just means that either the participants or the researcher or both don't know what condition they're in. This is just a common practice that we use in scientific research, especially when it comes to medical research. We just want to make sure that the participants don't know if they should be getting a treatment or not. We talked about placebo effects earlier. Placebo effects are the result of believing that you're getting a treatment. But if the participants don't know if they're actually getting a treatment or not, that might help to prevent a lot of those kinds of potential confounds. So there's different ways you can do blinding. You can do what's called a single blinded study, where the participants don't know which condition they're in. They don't know if they're getting the actual treatment or like some placebo control treatment. Or you could do what's more commonly practiced, what's more, comprehensive. It's called a double-blinded experiment. So that's where the participant and the researcher don't know which group the participant is in. If that sounds a little confusing, it can be, but the whole idea here is the researcher won't know how to handle this participant until the end of the study. They won't know if the participant is getting the treatment or not until the end of the study. And it is a little bit trickier to do, but it is definitely preferred, and it is pretty common to do it this way. Now, there's many other things to consider when it comes to getting a study started, when it comes to actually conducting research, besides just recruiting participants and standardizing procedure and all that. You have to worry about other kinds of things, like how are you going to keep track of your data? How are you going to do your record keeping? Obviously, you're going to want to keep track of the data that's the most important to your hypothesis, but it's also a good idea to record a few other kinds of things, such as basic demographic information. Even if your study has nothing to do with ethnicity or gender or age or anything like that, it's still a good idea to keep track of that information. It may not be interesting to you now, but maybe in the future it will be. Maybe you'll want to go back and look at, potential ethnic differences or something like that. Another thing you should definitely keep track of is who's doing these experiments. Like, was it you, or was it your partner, or was it somebody else? Because you might find later on that one of you was doing something weird, and you would like to know who collected that weird data so you could, potentially get rid of it or clean it up somehow. So keep track of the experimenter's name that was doing the experiment. It's also just a good idea to have space, like standardized place for these experimenters and maybe even the participants to just give you a little bit of additional feedback, some additional comments on how they were feeling during the experiment or anything weird that may have happened. It's always better to have more information than less, obviously. And like I said, this information may not be too important to you right now when you're doing your study, because all you really care about is testing your hypothesis, but you may really appreciate having this information later on. So keeping track of all that kind of stuff is basically, insurance. It's helping out your future self. You just want to try to make sure that you're not going to have any regrets later on. So we've made all these kinds of decisions about how we want to conduct our experiment, and now that you're ready to begin, there's one last thing you should definitely do, and that is test it out. When it comes to doing all different kinds of development, whether you're developing a new computer program or an experiment, it's always a good idea to have some beta testing, or you could call it pilot testing, before you begin. So pilot testing just refers to a small scale study conducted to make sure your new procedure is working the way you expect it to. And when it comes to doing pilot testing, you could really do it however you want. You could do it in a formal way where you have a subject pool and you recruit people from the community, or you can just, guilt trip your parents and your siblings and your friends and whoever into doing it for you. For a lot of my studies, when I was working on my PhD, I would basically just drag my wife to the laboratory and sit her down and have her do a pilot test on my studies for a few hours. If you have friends that are willing to do that kind of stuff for you, then that can be a great way to just iron out all the little bugs in your procedure. So when it comes to doing pilot testing, it's really just, you want to make sure everything works. You could maybe even just do it on yourself. The number of the participants can be very small, but it should be sufficiently large and sufficiently comprehensive to just give you the confidence that you need to begin. There's a lot of important uses for pilot testing. There's several important questions you can answer by conducting a pilot test. Some of the more obvious ones are things like, do the participants understand what they need to do? What are some common misunderstandings or mistakes or questions your participants might have? Maybe your experiment is a little bit on the longer side, and do you think your participants are becoming bored or frustrated with your experiment? Maybe you should, shorten it a bit. Is your manipulation effective? We talked previously about manipulation checks. Maybe you should include a lot of manipulation checks when you're doing pilot testing, just to make sure it's actually working the way you think it is. Another thing you should try to figure out during this pilot testing is, do your participants know what you expect? Can they guess at what your hypothesis might be? Because if the participants know what you want, that could bias the results. Other things is, you might not be fully aware of how long your experiment actually takes. So by doing a pilot test, you can get a good measure for how long this experiment lasts. And then finally, if you do use any kind of automation, like machines or computer programs or anything like that, are those just working the way you expect? Computer programs often have numerous bugs in them. So this is just a great way to check for any bugs that might pop up before you actually get started.